Midnight in Rome, the moment power became a lie. At midnight, this empire still believed it would last forever. But by dawn, Rome would understand something terrifying. It had already died. Chapter 1. The Illusion of Eternal Rome. For centuries, Rome did not simply rule the world, it believed it was the world. The Romans had a phrase for it, Roma Eterna, eternal Rome. Not a metaphor, a certainty. From Britain's cold frontiers to the sands of North Africa, Rome's roads, laws, and legions shaped daily life. Emperors changed, borders shifted, enemies rose and fell. Yet Rome endured. Fires had burned the city before. Civil wars had torn it apart. Assassinations were routine. Still, Rome survived every crisis. Survival became proof of destiny. By the early 5th century, the illusion was complete. The Senate still met. Marble temples still stood. Statues of dead emperors still watched over public squares. Coins still carried the faces of rulers who claimed divine favor. To the people of Rome, these symbols were not decorations. They were guarantees. As long as the rituals continued, as long as the city stood, Rome could not truly fall. But power had already moved away. The real decisions were no longer made in Rome. The strongest armies were stationed far from the city. Emperors preferred safer capitals. Taxes were failing. Borders were porous. Rome looked eternal, but it was hollow. Yet no one wanted to admit it, because empires do not collapse when they are weak. They collapse when they realize they are weak. Rome's greatest defense was no longer its legions or walls. It was memory. The memory of conquest, the memory of fear, the memory of a time when the name Rome alone could stop an enemy. And that memory was fading. Outside the city, barbarian armies moved closer. Inside, citizens argued theology, politics, and tradition, convinced that history itself would protect them. After all, Rome had always survived. What they did not understand was this. Eternity is not something an empire possesses. It is something it believes. And on the night Rome would be tested once more, belief was all it had left. Chapter 2. The night the gates were opened. The fall of Rome did not begin with fire in the streets or legions clashing at the gates. It began in silence. On the night of August 24th, 410 AD, the city slept behind walls that had protected it for centuries. Rome had not been breached by a foreign enemy in nearly 800 years. The idea itself felt impossible. Outside those walls waited the Visigoths, led by Alaric, a commander Rome had once employed, negotiated with, and ultimately betrayed. This was not a sudden invasion. It was the end of a long humiliation. Alaric had demanded land, payment, recognition. Rome responded with delays, broken promises, and political arrogance. The empire still spoke as if it held power it no longer possessed. When negotiations failed, Alaric did not attack immediately. He waited. He starved the city. He watched Rome argue with itself. That night, the Salarian Gate was opened. Not smashed, not burned. Opened. Whether by bribery, desperation, or betrayal, someone inside Rome made the decision that ended the illusion. The gates that once symbolized eternal security became an invitation. Visigoth soldiers entered the city under cover of darkness, moving through streets that had never known foreign boots. There was no grand battle, no heroic last stand. Rome simply yielded. For 3 days the city was plundered, palaces were stripped, statues were broken. Wealth accumulated over centuries vanished in hours. Citizens fled to churches, believing the old sanctuaries, pagan or Christian, might still offer protection. They did not. What terrified the world was not the destruction. Rome had survived worse. What terrified the world was this: Rome had been entered. The unthinkable had happened. The city that ruled empires could no longer protect itself. That single night destroyed something no army could rebuild: the myth of invincibility. When morning came, Rome still stood, but the gates had spoken, and they told the truth the empire had refused to face. Chapter 3. When the gods went silent. Rome had survived invasions, assassinations, and civil wars before, but what followed the sack of 410 AD was something far more dangerous than destruction. It was doubt. For centuries, Romans believed their empire was protected by divine order. The old gods, Jupiter, Mars, Minerva, were not merely worshipped. They were seen as guardians of Rome's destiny. Victory in war proved their favor. Survival confirmed their presence. As long as the gods were honored, Rome believed it could not fall. But now the impossible had happened. The city had been violated, its temples looted, its people humiliated, and the gods had done nothing. Inside Rome, confusion turned into panic. Pagan elites blamed the rise of Christianity, accusing the new faith of abandoning the ancient rituals that had secured Rome's greatness. If the gods were angry, they argued, this was the punishment. Christianity, once persecuted, now stood at the center of the empire, and Rome was paying the price. Christians answered differently. They claimed Rome's fall proved the weakness of earthly power itself. Empires, they argued, were not eternal. Only faith was. The sack of Rome was not divine failure. It was divine warning. But for ordinary Romans, theology mattered less than fear. The gods they had trusted, old or new, had not stopped the gates from opening. Prayers had not held back the night. The rituals had continued, but protection had not followed. For the first time, Rome felt unchosen. This spiritual collapse was more devastating than any army, because empires survive violence. They do not survive loss of meaning. When belief fractures, obedience weakens. When destiny disappears, loyalty fades. Rome was no longer the center of the world. It was a city arguing with itself about why the world had abandoned it. In the aftermath, a painful realization spread quietly through the empire. Rome had not been protected by gods. It had been protected by power. And now that power was gone, the gods, whatever their names, had fallen silent. Chapter 4. The morning after an empire. When the sun rose over Rome, after that fateful night of August 24th, 410 AD, the city was a ghost of itself. Smoke still curled from looted palaces, debris littered once pristine streets, and the echoes of frightened citizens lingered in empty forums. Rome had not been destroyed in fire or rubble. Its walls still stood, its monuments still rose into the sky, but the heart of the empire had been shattered. Across the known world, news traveled slowly, but carried weight far beyond the city's boundaries. Letters and messengers spread the story of the unthinkable. Rome, invincible for centuries, had been breached. Kings, generals, and emperors reacted with disbelief. The psychological impact was catastrophic. For centuries, the name Rome had commanded respect, fear, and obedience. Now it inspired shock and, in some cases, hope for those who had long chafed under its authority. Inside the city, life continued, but it was a fragile shadow of normalcy. Citizens scavenged what they could from the remains of palaces. Families huddled in churches, praying that the divine would intervene. Merchants counted their losses, soldiers repaired walls, and politicians blamed each other for failures they could no longer conceal. Even Rome's chroniclers realized this night would redefine history. St. Augustine began composing City of God, an attempt to reconcile faith with the collapse of earthly power. He wrote that Rome's fall was not a moral failure, but a reminder that empires built on human ambition alone were always vulnerable. The morning after was not merely a temporal moment, it was a revelation. Rome had survived in structure, but had lost its aura of inevitability. The world could no longer assume that Rome would endure. That assumption, once taken for granted for centuries, had been shattered in the darkness. By sunrise, the empire was still standing, but the illusion of eternal Rome was gone. The city had been humbled, and with that humility came a new truth. Power does not last because walls are high or legions strong. It lasts only as long as belief persists. Chapter 5. Rome survived, but power moved. Rome did not die in a single night. Its streets still echoed with life, its forums still held debate, and its walls remained formidable. Yet the reality of empire had shifted irreversibly. What had once been the center of the civilized world, the source of law, culture, and military might, was no longer where power truly resided. As the Visigoths withdrew with their plunder, the empire's political heart had already begun to beat elsewhere. Emperors increasingly ruled from safer, more distant cities. Constantinople rose in prominence, strategically positioned between East and West, where emperors could safeguard resources and influence without the vulnerability of old Rome. Slowly, the center of decision-making, of real authority, had moved east. Rome itself became a symbol, a shadow of former glory. Yet this transition was not only geographical, it was psychological. Rome remained in the collective imagination of the world, but its aura of invincibility was gone. Citizens and rulers alike began to understand a terrifying truth. The empire was no longer protected by its walls, its armies, or even its gods. It was vulnerable, like any other human institution. What mattered now was adaptation, not tradition. The power that once radiated from the Palatine Hill flowed elsewhere, quietly, almost invisibly. Trade, military strategy, and political influence gravitated toward new centers. Rome survived, but survival alone could not reclaim authority. It was no longer the empire that commanded fear and respect. It was a ghost, revered for history, mourned for strength lost, and yet the lessons endured. Rome became a cautionary tale for future rulers. No matter how monumental the city, how mighty the armies, or how eternal the ambition, empire is fleeting when belief and power diverge. The world moved on, leaving Rome to endure as a memory, a lesson, and a warning. Rome had survived, but the age of Rome as a center of true power was over. What remained was the echo of greatness, a reminder that empires live not merely in stone and sword, but in the imagination of those who obey, fear, and remember. If you want to uncover the secrets that history tried to hide, subscribe now and step into the shadows of empires.